To discuss this, we are joined now by Executive Director of Open Society Africa and a member of the delegation of the West Africa Elders Forum Election Monitoring Mission. Muthoni Wanyeki joins us now. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. What has been your observations? There obviously have been various reports. We mentioned the isolated incidents of violence, and there were also reports of widespread late opening of polls. What have you been able to observe?
Well, I've just been in Abuja. We went out to some polling stations this morning. They were a little bit late opening compared to other countries. They open late anyway. They were planning to be open from 8:30 to 2:30. And we gathered that there was about an hour delay in some parts of the country. But the EMB, the Electoral Management Body Chair, has consistently throughout the day sort of said if you're in the line by 2:30, you will get to vote. So it's not that the polling stations were closing exactly at 2:30. It was peaceful. They've dramatically increased the number of polling stations this time, which is a real logistical challenge. There are about 176,000 polling stations all across the country. And of course, infrastructure all across the country is wildly diverse. So just logistically holding the elections would have been a challenge anyway, even without the backdrop of insecurity that you referred to in your opening.
So logistical problems and security concerns was cited as reason for the long delays seen in some polling stations. Are you able to expand a little bit more by what logistical problems there were?
Well, as you're probably aware, the Naira was changed a couple of weeks ago, and that has precipitated a real cash shortage in the country. And of course, there's a fuel shortage as well. So that on top of just like any other African country, except that this is such a big African country, there are parts of the country that are pretty well developed in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the transmission masts and the sort of strength of the connectivity needed for the technology being used in this election to identify voters and transmit results. Yeah, but the shortage of cash and fuel really created a lot of concern among Nigerian observers that it may negatively affect turnout to vote today. I'm still not sure. We haven't seen figures yet of total turnout. But you mentioned that 93 million voters had registered. Just to get a sense of the scale of that, that compares with all voters in the rest of West Africa, just in Nigeria alone. Yesterday, the electoral management body mentioned that still a huge number, 87 million had picked up their cards. So we know 87 million were ready to go. It remains to be seen what turnout actually was. On the one hand, there's a lot of enthusiasm for the election. On the other hand, this cash and fuel shortage may have negatively affected turnout. We'll see.
And we'll get to the issue of turnout in just a moment, but just in terms of an environment that is conducive to a free and fair vote, there have been reports, particularly in Lagos, of violence and reports of ballot boxes being snatched. Have these reports reached you? Were you briefed on the circumstances around these alleged incidents?
Well, the electoral management body, INEC, has been coming online sort of every couple of hours to explain what has happened with these incidents. There were a couple of directly electoral, politically related violent incidents. coming from Borno, coming from Zamfara, coming from Port Harcourt, and as you mentioned, Lagos. But when you sort of consider the number of incidents reported compared to the whole scale of the operation, not that it's not concerning, but it's not, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's widespread yet. Of course, the overwhelming context within which the election is being held is one of varying different forms of insecurity in almost all parts of the country.
And there were reports actually coming in from the southern state of Delta and I think in northern state of Katsina of armed men apparently attacking polling stations. In some cases, they say they cut off voting stations. But though these incidents may not be widespread, but does it raise concern about what the outcome of the election results will be and how it will be received, just in terms of there were allegations, concerns ahead of the vote of corruption and some sort of manipulation of the vote?
Interestingly, I mean, relative to many other parts of the continent, including where I'm from in Kenya, despite the sort of, wild fringe sort of stuff online that attacks institutions like the electoral management body, tries to delegitimize whatever candidate, whatever party they're not for, there is actually a surprising level of confidence, public confidence in the electoral management body. And it's striking to me, given that we don't have that in the country that I'm from. So that tends to keep people calm. I think people do understand that this backdrop of insecurity is something that the electoral management body has had to contend with throughout. There's jihadist violence in the northeast, there's jihadist violence spreading to the northwest, pastoralist farmer violence in central, separatist violence in the southeast. It's not a stable country, and these are not problems that are directly linked to the election, but in some cases in the southeast and in the northeast and some of the west, there have been calls for people to stay away from the vote, boycott the vote. But like I say, when you look at the ways in which Nigerians turned out all across the country to register, and the number of people who did manage to pick up the voting cards, the strength of these calls and in terms of swaying Nigerians from exercising their vote has to be, tempered, I think.
And just very briefly, the voter turnout, would you say it was better than expected?
I don't have those figures completely yet. So waiting to see what the turnout actually was of the 87 million who registered and collected their cards.
Well, thank you very much, Executive Director of Open Society Africa and a member of the delegation of the West Africa Elders Forum Elections Monitoring Mission in Nigeria, Muthoni Wanyeki.